diplomatic contact with these visitors, but that it was very important that the world know this. So we started a project that's known as the Disclosure Project, which people can see at disclosureproject.org, where we began to identify military and corporate and CIA intelligence officers who had personal knowledge of the classified operations dealing with this subject, and to get them to come forward with our information to disclose this publicly. And that Disclosure Project really began in 1993, and around that time, of course, I was asked to brief President Clinton's team and his first CIA director, R. James Woolsey. So between 1993 and the year 2000, we spent a great deal of time not only putting together the evidence and the proof, which is available at disclosureproject.org, but meeting with members of the Senate Intelligence Committee in the United States, meeting with former ministers of defense in Great Britain, people who were in the White House staff, and of course very high officials at the Pentagon, including the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, to name a few. And also at this time, the UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali, his family were very interested in this, and his wife Leah Ghali became very interested, and we met with her and gave briefing materials for them. So it was a public education effort, because what we felt was necessary was that the secrecy should be ended and this information disclosed, so that humanity, not just one country in America, but all of humanity, could make peaceful contact with these civilizations visiting us, but also would lay the foundation for these new technologies, the energy and propulsion systems that are behind these UFOs that are so mysterious. How are they flying? Well, this is understood, but they are in classified projects. So that was another objective, was to get the technologies out to the public so we could have a civilization that would get freed from the use of oil and the destruction of the environment. This is a very good question. How do you get all these sort of people to come forward on a subject that is the object of so much social opprobrium, ridicule, and threats? I mean, people's lives have been taken to keep this secret. I remind people that the 1951 Canadian top-secret memo written by Wilbur Smith stated very directly that not only were these flying saucers, as they were called back then, real, but that it was the most classified secret in the United States, exceeding the secrecy of the development of the hydrogen bomb in the 1950s. So it's very, very, very secret. And the way that we approached this was to first articulate a vision. What good would come from disclosing this? Okay? Well, first of all, it would put the legal constitutional governments of the world back in control, because they're not in control now. President Clinton had no control over this matter. People close to President Kennedy and President Carter have told me they had no control over the management of this issue. It was taken out of their hands and has been illegally, by rogue elements within the corporate, aerospace, military intelligence community, been run under the radar screen, secretly. So that would be a very important outcome, because it would put the rule of law and civilization back in control of a very important issue. But also, I think that the way we got people to come forward was that we didn't say, come forward just with one person. We waited until we had hundreds. And when we first came forward in 2001 at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., and this was broadcast all over the world, we had at that time over 110 of these military and intelligence officers who had been filmed, and there were about 22 of them at the press conference. But we put out transcripts of testimony of dozens and dozens of these men, and they came out together. And so in a large number, there's security and there's credibility. Because if only one person who's a radar operator for the Strategic Air Command says he saw something, well, you can say, oh, he saw nothing, he was imagining, he's lying. If you have 12 credentialed people with top secret clearances who said that they have tracked these on radar and have seen how it's been kept secret, then that becomes dispositive. That becomes the proof. So we wanted to have that critical mass, and it also gave these men and a few women the sense that it would be done seriously and that they would have the support of their colleagues. And so before we ever came public, we got them all together as a group, you see, and many of them. And so this encouraged them to come forward, and that's what we continue to do. Many people ask the question, how have we been able to reach all the officials in government? I think a couple of things. One is, as I mentioned, the vision behind what we're doing. People know, people who are in the know. I don't mean in the UFO community, but I mean in senior ranks of government, not just the United States, but in Europe and around the world, know that we've actually made contact. And this gets a great deal of attention to these high officials. Secondly, they know that we're doing this in a very truthful way, in a very direct way, with serious purpose. So they know that we're not going to waste their time. And thirdly, we have relied on networking. I tell people I was just a country doctor in North Carolina when I started this. You know, I was working in an emergency department. My background is emergency trauma medicine. And when I had the idea to do this, it was very much an idea. I did not have the network. But over a period of years, we made this network, and people who did know senior officials at the Pentagon and senior people in the government and in the Congress came to me. I didn't find them. They found me and said, look, I think this is very important. I can set up a meeting with Senator Bryan, who at the time was on the Senate Intelligence Committee, or the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. So it all unfolded very organically, like a flower. And it's really been quite an adventure. But it wasn't because I had any family connections to these people. It was all through networking. And I think the power of the message is that it's really time for the secrecy to end, and for us to make peaceful contact with these visitors, and for the technologies that are behind these objects to be the new energy source to run the planet, so that there's sustainability, the end of poverty, the end of pollution, and the end of the environmental crisis. This is a very big issue. Of course, on the other side is people who do not want that to happen, and they are very powerful. And I have met with them as well, many of them. And some of them support what we are doing, and some don't. And I think in the early days, I'm talking the 1930s, 1940s, they didn't really know what they were dealing with. They also did not understand the technologies. And I think that they also didn't know why these visitors were here. For example, the big increase in all the sightings around the world happened at the time when we began to detonate nuclear weapons. This is not an accident. And I've been told by senior intelligence officials that essentially a big red flag went up over our planet saying we were in trouble. But not only are we in trouble, but we could be a threat to others. Because you combine going into space, the early stages of space travel, and the use of hydrogen bombs and nuclear weapons, and a civilization on Earth that was still very violent, as you look around the Earth even today, of course. So this is something that any enlightened or even self-interested civilization observing the Earth, which I think we've been under observation for thousands of years, would be greatly concerned. But our military and government were completely shocked by this and didn't know what to do with it. I think that's the early. But later, I understand, of course, President Eisenhower wanted to make an announcement about this after he had a meeting near Edwards Air Force Base in 1954. But he was prevented from doing so by what he later called the military-industrial complex, because the interests for secrecy are really fall into three broad areas. One is the inertia of the secrecy. Once you start something secret and you have made so many lies and frankly killed so many people and threatened so many people, and you've lied to Congress and you've lied to presidents, how do you bring this out? They painted themselves into a black box, black corner. The other, so that's the inertia. The other is that there were orthodox religious interests that did not know what to make of this. And I've had discussions with senior levels at the Vatican to discuss this. And today, most mainstream religious groups would say, well, there's one supreme being in the universe, and there are many children of God, and we're all children of God. This is what Monsignor Balducci said when we interviewed him at the Vatican. But the orthodox and fundamentalists would view this in a very disturbing way, because it would upset their worldview. And I think then the biggest became the technological and scientific end of this. Once we retrieved, back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, several of these extraterrestrial vehicles and began to study them, we combined that knowledge with knowledge we already had. Because remember, we had some people like T. Townsend Brown and the Biefeld-Brown effect who were studying anti-gravity quite independent of this issue back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. But when their information got combined with studying these spacecraft, they figured out, this is how they're working. And they realized it's the end of oil. It's the end of the need for coal. It's the end of the combustion engine, the internal combustion engine. It's the end of transmission lines for electricity. Because the energy that these spaceships are using, what people call UFOs, we don't call them. No one in the business calls them UFOs. They are not unidentified and they don't fly. We'll get to this. But these objects are extracting energy from the fabric of space. Okay, around, not outer space, but the fabric of space. And in fact, even the early Lockheed and Northrop experimental spaceships that we have built, and we're talking 1950s and 60s, were called flux liners because they were pulling energy from the quantum flux field, what's called the quantum flux field that's in the space in this room. And every cubic centimeter of space, for example, in this room has enough energy to run the Earth for a day. It's a huge amount of energy. And so once this was really figured out by the mid-50s, long time ago, 50 years ago, they knew that this would be the end of the oil cartels and the international financial petrodollar system, and a huge amount of the industrialists would then have to change their whole way of operating. Because think about it. What happens when every village in India or sub-Saharan Africa can have a device that looks like a generator and it's extracting energy from this quantum flux field? Suddenly, you have an economic growth all over the world. And this is a wonderful thing. It would be the end of poverty. But it would also be the end of the economic hegemony, where Europe and America, with 600 million people, dominate the whole global economy of 6 billion. So this is a huge geopolitical problem. And so the issue isn't about just money. It's about power. Who has the power? How the Earth is run? Who is running Earth? And then you have another issue. And that is, there are people who view the world as they understand it. And in America we have a saying, if you wear rose-colored glasses, you see everything in the world is rose-colored. But if you're wearing glasses that are conflict-colored, colored with a sort of paranoid and militaristic view of the world, you're going to view these visitors as a threat. And you're going to respond to them as a threat, even though there's no evidence that they're a threat. I want to be very clear on this. There's no objective evidence that anyone has been harmed by these visitors, and there's certainly no evidence that they're a threat to us. There's a lot of evidence, however, that they're concerned about our threat to the peace and the order of space. Why? Because our technological capabilities and our weapons have surpassed our social and spiritual development, clearly. And we are at that stage in the evolution of a global civilization where our science and technology has gotten way out there, but our social and spiritual is lagging. And this is that danger zone. And Earth is in this danger zone now. And they know this. These visitors from other civilizations, other planets, know this. So, unfortunately, I think that they have had a great concern about our nuclear facilities. We know this. We have colonels and lieutenant colonels who are Strategic Air Command and the Atomic Energy Commission who have testified at disclosureproject.org that every single one of our nuclear weapon storage areas have been visited by these ET spacecraft because they were obviously concerned. And in the Soviet Union also, and in Russia. We have spoken to people with the KGB and with their space command. And so it's clear that they have that concern. But that doesn't mean that they're hostile towards Earth. I think they're concerned about human hostility. And I think, however, this has gotten misinterpreted. Because here's the risk. In the vacuum of secrecy, when you have this vacuum of secrecy, it's very easy to begin to believe your own worldview, and there's no one telling you differently. This is the danger of a program being hermetically sealed and kept this secret, because they do not get the perspective, and it's gotten out of control. And Eisenhower said when he left office in 1961, beware the military-industrial complex, because it can become a threat to our security, our way of life, and our democratic institutions. And he was a five-star general and a conservative Republican, but he was very concerned. And why? We had people who worked with him in the White House at that time who have told us, who are witnesses for our group, that he had been stabbed in the back by people who wanted to keep this secret and actually trumped or violated his presidential power and took these projects and hid them deeper and deeper and deeper. This is a very dangerous thing in a world where you're dealing with technologies this powerful. And this was, of course, President Clinton's frustration. President Clinton asked Webster Hubbell, who is third in command at Justice, to look into two things. And this is in his book, Webster Hubbell's book, Friends in High Places. Clinton wanted him to find out about what are these UFOs, and, who's keeping it secret and why, and who killed Jack Kennedy, because Jack Kennedy was his hero. Well, we discovered there was a connection. But, and his CIA director, R. James Woolsey, was equally worried, because when I met personally with Woolsey here in the Washington area in December of 1993, he was very gravely shaken by the fact that there was a secret cabal or a whole level of government and corporate activity dealing with this issue that was lying to him as the CIA director and as also to the president. So this is a very serious problem, and so the secrecy is related to a number of related issues. One is this inertia that happens when you have this large, ongoing historical problem of secrecy. The other is certain orthodoxies of both religion and science that people don't want out. Because, obviously, if you own a $1 trillion oil field,